At 10:23 a.m., on a Wednesday morning, in Suffolk County Small Claims Court, Judge Rebecca Martinez asked my mother's attorney to present evidence of our alleged rental agreement. The silence that followed lasted exactly 17 seconds, I counted, while attorney Michael Stevens shuffled through papers that didn't contain what he needed. Meanwhile, I sat quietly at the defendant's table with a manila folder full of bank transfers, receipts, and financial records that would turn my mother's lawsuit inside out. She had no idea that while she was claiming I owed her $18,000 in back rent, I had documentation showing I'd been quietly paying her mortgage for 3 years. Where are you watching from right now? If you've ever been accused of taking advantage, when you were actually the one being taken advantage of, this story's about the moment when truth meets delusion in a courtroom. My name is Rebecca Chen, I'm 29 years old, and I've been supporting my mother financially while she convinced herself, and tried to convince a judge, that I was the one exploiting her generosity. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so painful. But let me take you back to where this story really begins. To the family dynamic that made my mother believe she was entitled to rent money while I was paying her bills. After my father died 4 years ago, Mom struggled with both grief and finances. Dad had been the primary breadwinner as a mechanical engineer, while Mom worked part-time as a school secretary. His sudden heart attack at 57 left her with a mortgage she couldn't afford, credit card debt from his medical bills, and no clear plan for maintaining the lifestyle they'd built together. I had just finished my master's degree in data analytics, and landed my first job at a consulting firm in downtown Boston. The logical solution seemed obvious. I'd move back home temporarily, help Mom adjust to her new financial reality, and we'd both save money while figuring out next steps. What I didn't anticipate was that Mom's grief would manifest as denial about our family's financial situation, combined with resentment that she needed help from her daughter. Linda Chen had always been proud of her independence. She'd immigrated from Taiwan at 25, learned English while working multiple jobs, and built a comfortable middle-class life with Dad. Having to accept help felt like failure to her, so she began reframing the situation in ways that preserved her sense of control. Rebecca is living here rent-free while she saves money for her own place, became her explanation to friends and relatives. Never mind that I was contributing $2,800 monthly to household expenses. Never mind that I'd taken over the mortgage payments entirely after her third late notice. The narrative that made her feel better was the one where I was the beneficiary of her generosity. The arrangement started reasonably. I moved into my childhood bedroom, we split groceries and utilities, and I helped with larger expenses when needed. Mom kept working part-time, maintained her social activities, and seemed to be adjusting to widowhood with appropriate support. But as months turned into years, the financial reality became more complicated. Mom's part-time salary of $1,200 monthly barely covered her personal expenses. The mortgage payment was $2,100. Property taxes added another $400 monthly. Insurance, utilities, maintenance, and basic household costs pushed total housing expenses to nearly $3,200 per month. I wasn't just helping out, I was subsidizing her entire lifestyle, while she maintained the fiction that she was doing me a favor by letting me live there. The breaking point came 8 months ago during a family barbecue at my cousin Jennifer's house. Mom was talking to my Aunt Susan about how difficult it was to have an adult child living at home. Rebecca is 29 and still in her childhood bedroom, Mom complained, loud enough for half the party to hear. I keep telling her she needs to find her own place, but it's so convenient for her to live rent-free while building her career. I was standing 10 feet away, holding the potato salad I'd bought and the wine I'd contributed to the gathering. I'd spent $2,100 that morning on Mom's mortgage payment, the same payment I'd been making for 18 months. Maybe you should start charging her rent, suggested my uncle. David. Nothing teaches independence like real responsibility. Mom's eyes lit up with the validation she'd been seeking. You know, David, that's not a bad idea. Market rate for a room in Newton is probably $600 or $700 a month. I walked over to the conversation casually. Mom, we should probably discuss housing arrangements privately rather than at family gatherings. Why? She asked, her voice taking on the defensive tone that had become increasingly common. It's not unreasonable to expect an adult daughter to contribute to household expenses. I do contribute to household expenses, I said quietly. Significantly, groceries and utilities aren't the same as rent, Rebecca. You're living in my house using my space, benefiting from my investment. In the property. Aunt Susan nodded approvingly. Linda's right, honey. Independence means paying your own way. What my aunt didn't know, what Mom had apparently forgotten or chosen to ignore, was that her investment in the property was being maintained entirely by my monthly payments. But I decided not to create a scene at Jennifer's barbecue. We can discuss this at home, Mom. That conversation never happened in any productive way. Instead, Mom spent the following weeks researching rental rates, consulting with friends about appropriate charges for adult children, and building a case for why I owed her retroactive rent dating back to when I'd first moved home. Rebecca, I've been very generous letting you live here without formal rent payments, she announced one evening in November. But I've realized that I've been enabling your dependence instead of encouraging your growth. I was sitting at the kitchen table, paying her Visa bill online, the card she'd used for holiday shopping and routine expenses she couldn't cover. With her part-time income. Mom, what exactly are you proposing? Starting January 1st, rent will be $700 per month. And I think it's fair to ask for back rent covering the past year, since you've been benefiting from below-market housing costs. I set down my laptop and looked at her carefully. You want me to pay $700 monthly in rent, plus back rent for the past year? Market rate in this neighborhood is actually higher, but I'm willing to give you a family discount. The conversation was surreal. Mom was asking me to pay rent on top of the mortgage payments, utility bills, grocery costs, and household maintenance I was already covering. She was asking for additional money to live in a house that I was essentially financing. Mom, let's review our actual household expenses and financial contributions before we discuss rental arrangements. Rebecca, this isn't about money. It's about responsibility and independence. You're 29 years old. You need to start acting like an adult. The accusation stung not because it was accurate, but because it was so completely backwards. I was acting like an adult. I was supporting both of us financially while allowing her to maintain her dignity. She was acting like someone who preferred comfortable delusions to difficult realities. But I decided to try a different approach. Mom, what if we created a formal household budget that accounts for all expenses and contributions? That way we can have a clear understanding of costs and responsibilities. I don't need to justify asking my adult daughter to pay rent in my own house. And that was the end of rational discussion. Mom had made her decision based on what felt emotionally satisfying rather than what made financial sense. She wanted to be the generous mother graciously housing her dependent daughter, not the widow being quietly supported by her child's career success. The ultimatum came in December: pay $700 monthly rent plus $8,400 in back rent for the previous year, or move out by January 31st. I had two choices. I could pay the additional money and continue subsidizing her fantasy about our financial arrangement, or I could move out and let her face the reality of her actual housing costs. I chose a third option that she didn't see coming. On January 15th, I moved into a one-bedroom apartment in Cambridge, 20 minutes from my office. The rent was $2,400 monthly, significantly more than the $700 Mom had been demanding, but worth it for the independence and clarity of a straightforward landlord-tenant relationship. I also stopped making Mom's mortgage payment. The first month, she managed fine using savings. The second month, she paid late but avoided penalties. By the third month, she was calling me in panic about foreclosure notices and overdue bills. Rebecca, I'm having some temporary financial difficulties. Could you help me out with the mortgage this month? Mom, I'd be happy to help, but I'm already paying $2,400 in rent for my own place. I can't afford to pay rent twice. This isn't rent, it's helping family during a crisis. I understand it feels different to you, but the financial reality is the same. I can't afford both my apartment and your mortgage payments. She hung up angry, convinced I was being spiteful rather than realistic about my budget constraints. The fourth month brought threats from the mortgage company. The fifth month brought actual foreclosure proceedings. By the sixth month, Mom had convinced herself that my refusal to resume mortgage payments was a form of elder abuse and financial manipulation. That's when she filed the lawsuit. Mom's complaint claimed that I had lived in her house rent-free for 3 years, benefiting from below-market housing while contributing nothing to household expenses. She calculated damages at $600 monthly for 30 months, totaling $18,000 in unpaid rent, plus court costs and attorney fees. The lawsuit was based on a narrative that painted me as an exploitative adult child who had taken advantage of her mother's generosity, and was now abandoning her in retaliation for being asked to pay fair rent. Her attorney, Michael Stevens, was a family law specialist who had apparently accepted Mom's version of events without investigating the underlying financial arrangements. His initial demand letter accused me of unjust enrichment and threatened to seek additional damages for emotional distress caused by my sudden abandonment of family responsibilities. I hired Sarah Kim, a litigation attorney who specialized in financial disputes, and provided her with 3 years of bank records, receipts, and documentation of every payment I'd made toward Mom's household expenses. "Rebecca, this is unusual," Sarah said after reviewing my financial records. "Your mother is suing you for rent while you are actually paying her mortgage, that's correct?" She seems to have convinced herself that groceries and utilities were my only contributions to the household. "Do you have documentation of the mortgage payments?" I opened my laptop and showed Sarah 3 years of online banking records. Every month, a payment of $2,100 from my checking account directly to Mom's mortgage servicer. Every month for 36 months. "What about other household expenses?" I showed her receipts for property tax payments when Mom fell behind, insurance payments when her account was overdrawn, utility bills when her part-time income couldn't cover basic costs, and grocery expenses that averaged $400 monthly. "Rebecca, according to these records, you contributed over $90,000 to your mother's household expenses during the period she claims you lived there, rent-free." "That sounds about right. The mortgage alone was $2,500 monthly, but there were also taxes, insurance, utilities, food, and occasional emergency expenses." Sarah leaned back in her chair. "This isn't a landlord-tenant dispute. This is a family financial support arrangement that your mother has retroactivized as a rental situation. Can she do that legally? She can try, but courts generally don't recognize retroactive rental agreements without written contracts or evidence of mutual understanding about rental terms. More importantly, your financial contributions during the alleged rental period exceed her claimed damages by a factor of 5. Sarah's strategy was straightforward: demonstrate that I had been supporting Mom financially rather than exploiting her generosity, and request dismissal of the case, with attorney fees paid by the plaintiff. The hearing was scheduled for March 15th in Suffolk County Small Claims Court. Mom attended with Attorney Stevens, who had prepared a presentation about reasonable rental rates and adult children's responsibilities to contribute to household expenses. Judge Rebecca Martinez, no relation despite sharing my first name, was a veteran of small claims disputes who had presumably seen every variation of family financial conflict. "Miss Chen," the judge addressed my mother, "you're claiming that your daughter lived in your home rent-free for 3 years and owes you $18,000 in back rent. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Rebecca benefited from below-market housing while contributing nothing to household expenses. When I finally asked her to pay fair rent, she moved out in retaliation. "Mr. Stevens, do you have evidence of a rental agreement between your client and her daughter?" Attorney Stevens shuffled through his papers looking for documentation that didn't exist. "Your Honor, while there was no written lease, there was an implicit understanding that adult children should contribute to household expenses." The 17 seconds of silence that followed were excruciating. Stevens had prepared for a case about deadbeat adult children, not for a case about family financial support arrangements. "Your Honor, we believe the understanding was implicit in the parent-child relationship and the cultural expectation of reciprocal family support." Judge Martinez turned to me. "Miss Chen, how do you respond to your mother's claims?" I stood and approached the bench with my manila folder. "Your Honor, I have documentation showing that during the 3 years I lived in my mother's home, I contributed over $90,000 to household expenses, including paying her mortgage directly for 36 consecutive months." I handed the judge my bank records, highlighted to show the monthly mortgage payments. Judge Martinez reviewed the documents carefully, her eyebrows rising as she processed the financial information. "Ms. Chen, these records show monthly payments of $2,100 directly to your mother's mortgage servicer. Is this accurate?" "Yes, Your Honor." "I also have documentation of property tax payments, insurance payments, utility bills, and grocery expenses that I covered during the same period." The judge turned back to Mom and her attorney. "Mr. Stevens, were you aware that the defendant was making mortgage payments on your client's behalf during the alleged rental period?" Stevens looked genuinely shocked. Your Honor, this is the first time this information has been presented. Ms. Chen, the judge addressed my mother directly, did your daughter pay your mortgage for 3 years? Mom's face had gone pale. She helped with some expenses, but that was her choice. I never asked her to pay the mortgage. But she did pay the mortgage? Yes, and property taxes? Sometimes, and insurance? When necessary, but Judge Martinez held up her hand to stop Mom's increasingly desperate explanations. Ms. Chen, let me understand this correctly. You're suing your daughter for $18,000 in rent for a period during which she voluntarily paid $90,000 in household expenses, including your mortgage? The courtroom was silent except for the sound of a turn. Stevens quietly closing his briefcase. Even he could see where this was heading. Ms. Chen, the judge continued, addressing me, do you have documentation of these additional expenses? I handed her receipts for property taxes, insurance payments, utility bills, and grocery expenses spanning 3 years. Your Honor, I also have documentation showing that I moved out only after my mother demanded additional rent payments on top of the household expenses I was already covering. Judge Martinez reviewed the additional documents, shaking her head slightly. Mr. Stevens, in light of this evidence, do you wish to amend your client's complaint? Stevens looked at Mom, who was staring at the financial documents as if seeing them for the first time. Your Honor, we request a brief recess to consult with our client. Request denied. Mr. Stevens, your client has filed a lawsuit claiming unjust enrichment while her daughter was actually providing substantial financial support. This appears to be a case of fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of family financial arrangements. The judge turned back to me. Ms. Chen, are you seeking any counterclaims for the expenses you covered? No, Your Honor. I provided that support willingly as help for my mother during a difficult period. I simply want the court to recognize that I did not live rent-free or exploit my mother's generosity. The evidence clearly supports that conclusion. Judge Martinez addressed Mom directly. Ms. Chen, your daughter's financial contributions to your household far exceeded any reasonable rental payments for the period in question. This lawsuit appears to be based on a misunderstanding of your actual financial arrangements. She continued, furthermore, demanding additional rent from someone who was already paying your mortgage represents an unreasonable expectation. Hat could not form the basis of a valid rental agreement. Attorney Stevens tried one final argument. Your Honor, regardless of past arrangements, the defendant did abandon her family responsibilities when she moved out. Judge Martinez's expression hardened. Mr. Stevens, your client demanded that her daughter pay rent on top of mortgage payments she was already making. When her daughter chose to pay rent for her own apartment instead, that was a reasonable financial decision, not abandonment of family responsibilities. The verdict was swift and unambiguous. I find for the defendant. The plaintiff's claim is dismissed with prejudice. The defendant's financial contributions during the alleged rental period far exceeded any reasonable rental obligations. The judge paused and looked directly at Mom. Ms. Chen, I strongly recommend that you review your financial records and consider family counseling to address the misunderstandings that led to this litigation. As we left the courtroom, Attorney Stevens approached me with what looked like genuine embarrassment. Ms. Chen, I apologize for not investigating the financial arrangements more thoroughly before filing this case. Mr. Stevens, you represented your client based on the information she provided. The problem wasn't your legal work, it was her understanding of the situation. Mom had walked out without speaking to me, clearly humiliated by having her narrative completely dismantled in public. But an hour later, she called. Rebecca, we need to talk. I'm willing to talk, Mom, but only if we can have an honest conversation about what actually happened and why. We met at a coffee shop halfway between my apartment and her house. Mom looked older than I'd seen her look since Dad's funeral, worn down by months of financial stress and the courtroom revelation that she'd been completely wrong about our living arrangement. Rebecca, I need to apologize for the lawsuit. I honestly believed you had been living rent-free while I supported you. Mom, why did you believe that when you knew I was paying your mortgage? She was quiet for a long time, stirring her coffee and staring out the window. Because it was easier than admitting that I couldn't afford to live in our house without your help. It was easier than acknowledging that my 29-year-old daughter was supporting me financially. There's no shame in needing help, Mom. Dad's death created financial challenges that no one could have predicted. But there is shame in needing help when you're supposed to be the parent. There is shame in being dependent on your child when you raised her to be independent. I reached across the table and took her hand. Mom, helping each other isn't about dependence or independence. It's about family members using their different strengths to solve problems together. I turned our mutual support into a conflict because I couldn't handle the reality of our situation. What matters now is whether we can rebuild our relationship based on honest communication instead of comfortable narratives. We spent 2 hours in that coffee shop having the most honest conversation we'd had since Dad died. Mom acknowledged that her pride had made her reframe financial support as exploitation. I acknowledged that I should have insisted on clearer communication about our arrangements, instead of letting misunderstandings develop. 6 months later, we'd worked out a new living arrangement that respected both her need for independence and the financial realities of her situation. Mom sold the house she couldn't afford and moved into a smaller condo that fit her budget. I helped with the down payment as a gift, not a loan, and she covered all ongoing expenses herself. More importantly, we established honest communication about money, support, and family responsibilities. When Mom needed help, she asked directly instead of creating complex narratives about who owed what to whom. When I provided help, I did so clearly and transparently, instead of letting assumptions develop. The courthouse experience had been humiliating for Mom, but ultimately therapeutic for both of us. It forced us to confront the difference between perception and reality, between what we wanted to believe about our situation and what was actually happening. Most significantly, it taught us both that family financial support works best when it's acknowledged honestly, rather than disguised as something else. If you're still watching at this point, drop receipts in the comments so I know who understood why documentation matters in family disputes. The lesson I learned from being sued by my own mother wasn't about legal strategies or financial planning. It was about the danger of letting comfortable narratives replace difficult truths, both for the people creating those narratives and for the people who enable them. Mom's lawsuit wasn't really about rent money. It was about her inability to accept that she needed help, and her need to reframe that help as a favor she was providing to me. She needed to be the generous mother housing her struggling daughter, not the struggling widow being supported by her successful daughter. I had enabled that narrative by not insisting on clear communication about our financial arrangements. I had allowed her to maintain her preferred version of reality, instead of requiring honest acknowledgement of what was actually happening. The courtroom forced both of us to confront documentation over perception, facts over feelings, and reality over the stories we tell ourselves to avoid uncomfortable truths. Family financial support can be wonderful and necessary, but it has to be based on honest communication and mutual understanding. When family members need help, the healthiest approach is acknowledging that need directly rather than creating complex narratives that disguise dependence as generosity. The most important relationship skill isn't avoiding conflict, it's ensuring that conflicts are based on actual disagreements rather than misunderstandings about basic facts. Tell me about a time when your family's perception of a situation was completely different from the reality. How did you handle the gap between what they believed and what was actually happening? What would you do differently if you could go back and address those misunderstandings earlier?